Pre-Colonial Black Africa by Sheikh Anta Diop. Chapter 6: Economic Organization. Africa, in the eyes of the specialist, is depicted as a land which prior to colonization was only at the level of a subsistence economy. The individual, virtually crushed by the force of nature, was able to produce only what he absolutely needed to survive. No creation, no activity reflecting a society freed from material constraints might be found there. Exchange relationships were governed by barter. Notions of money, credit, stock market, thrift, or accumulation of wealth by individuals belonged to a type of commerce connected with a higher economic organization. They could not have been found at the alleged level of African economy. Seldom has an opinion been so little founded on fact. This one arose from a preconceived idea of African societies. They had to be specifically primitive, therefore endowed in every respect with the systems characteristic of such a condition. Barter. Undeniably, at the periphery of the African kingdoms, some backward tribes, such as the Lemlem in southwest Ghana, perhaps on the banks of the present-day Falemé River, have been carrying on barter trade since the Carthaginian period. Herodotus attests to this. That situation remained inflexibly unaltered until the 12th century, as corroborated by the accounts of Arab travelers, e.g. Ibn Yaqut. For these people, in every way comparable to the still unassimilated barbarians who roamed on the outskirts of the Roman Empire, the notion of merchandise in the modern sense was probably unknown. Barter was the foundation of all their commercial activity. After crossing the desert separating Ghana from Upper Senegal, the Arabs reached the banks of the Falemé, unloaded their goods in small bunches, varied products from the Orient, gave a signal, and then retreated. The Africans then came out and in front of each bundle placed the quantity of gold dust they judged it to be worth, then withdrew. The Arabs came back and collected the gold if they found the amounts satisfactory. If not, the cycle was repeated, still without any direct contact. Sociologists and ethnologists agree that commerce conducted under such conditions excludes any awareness of merchandise. The gold in this instance is not even money, but a local product which is traded for goods or other materials not native to the country. These tribes living in a virtually closed society had much less need for the glittering Oriental baubles to improve their living conditions than did the Carthaginian and Arab traders for the gold they harvested. One may assume, therefore, from the very fact that they were in a less developed state, that the honesty governing these exchanges came from them. They imposed it from the start. If they were swindled, they could, without loss to the essentials of their life, suspend relations with any given group of traders so identified. This was the nature of commerce along the borders of the kingdom. Only by applying it in a misguided generalization to all the rest of the continent could one reach the above-mentioned theories. Modern type commerce. In actuality, there was another form of commercial activity, already modern in type, that was much more extensive, covering all of the kingdoms. it was carried on by the best organized and most dynamic elements of society, by those, in a word, who were already detribalized. There were already entire merchant classes in the empire of Ghana and Songhai. The Tariq es Sudan alludes to their activities in the already international centers of Timbuktu and Djenné. The density of Niger River traffic between these two cities at that period could never be suspected today. Kabara was the true military and commercial port through which all goods were exported from Timbuktu to Djenné, Mali, and the upper Niger in general, or to Reka, Gao, and Tatameka, Kukia, and the Dendai country, that is, present-day Upper Dahomey, Benin. According to the Tariq el-Fatah, entire groups were devoted to commerce. If you ask what difference there is between the Malinke and the Ungara, know that the Ungaras and Malinkes share the same origin, but that Malinke is used to designate the warriors, whereas Ungara serves to indicate the merchants who carry on trading from one country to another. Bakri likewise informs us that the Nungamarata were a group of traders who exported gold from Erenzni on the upper Senegal to all countries. This city is very close to the gold-bearing stronghold of Giaru, previously mentioned. After the destruction of Carthage by Scipio Africanus Minor, the Roman expedition which pursued the fleeing Carthaginians to discover where they got the gold reached this point, the source of the Bambouk, the name given by the Romans to the Senegal River. The existence of whole groups devoted to commerce, the ancestors of the present-day Djula and Sarkol, being confirmed, there remains to be defined the type of exchange they practiced. The characteristics of modern economic activity could already be detected in it: the existence of money, a well-defined tariff system, and cosmopolitan commerce centers throughout each country. In addition to the two previously mentioned cities, Timbuktu and Djenné, known as far as Asia and Europe, there were Beirut, Su, Nadab, and Pekies, and so on. In all these centers, foreign nationals had their own quarters in which they could live in the utmost security with their goods while pursuing their business. For the most part, these were Arabs from North Africa, Egypt, and Yemen, and Europeans, especially Spaniards. Some of them were even students in Timbuktu, as will be seen later. Black Africa was hospitable to foreigners. We already know that the king of Djenné wished for there to be more foreigners than natives in his capital, but his last wish, the last of three, was that God might weary all those who had come only to peddle their wares, so that, bored with staying in this place, they might sell their shoddy goods at bargain prices to the benefit of the inhabitants. Currency. Economic concerns existed on all levels. The sale of goods was strictly regulated. There were fixed market days. The economic officer of the city then levied taxes in the name of the king. They might be paid in either goods or cash, especially in Timbuktu. As earlier observed, an appropriate duty was placed at the border on all goods imported or exported. The currency used consisted of salt, cowries, or gold in either dust or pieces, of foreign or local mintage. It at first glance might appear astonishing that blocks or pieces of salt of different sizes should constitute a currency. It must be remembered in this regard that certain substances, such as salt and copper, were as rare in Africa at that time as gold was abundant. Indeed, in certain regions, copper jewelry was more highly prized than that of gold. In ancient times, gold was less expensive than copper in Nubia, that is, the Sudan, of which Khartoum is the present capital. According to Bakri, salt was worth its weight in gold among the people he calls El Farouin, who was said to be in northern Senegal in the vicinity of the Lake of Guiers. The value assigned to any substance is always in terms of its rarity. Thus, cowries which came from the Indian Ocean via Persia, according to Leo Africanus, could serve as currency. It was, therefore, not a matter of backward peoples unable to conceive and produce coins of gold or other metals, for as we shall see, such coinage was very widespread in black Africa at that time. As for gold dust, a conventional quantity of approximately 4.6 grams, probably more often measured than weighed, constituted what was called the mitkal of gold dust. This was the gold standard, in the strictest modern sense of the term, on the basis of which minted coins, whose composition might be adulterated with non-precious metals, as well as cowries, were exchanged. The mitkal, depending on the rates of exchange, was worth anywhere from 500 to 3,000 cowries, available documents inform us. Obviously, all this was relative to prevailing conditions. A gold dust standard was used because in this form the metal was more difficult to adulterate. Identical weights of gold or heavier ones were effectively turned into coins, with embossed designs at mints, for commercial exchange purposes, as evidenced by this passage from Idrisi about gold collection among the Lemlem. When the river returns to its bed, everyone sells his gold. The bulk of it is bought by the inhabitants of Warjalan in present-day Libya, and by those from the tip of West Africa, whither this gold is transported to the mints, coined into dinars, and traded commercially for goods. This is how it happens each year. This is the principal product of the land of the blacks, great and small. They make it their livelihood. In the country of the Ungara, there are flourishing cities and renowned fortresses. Its inhabitants are wealthy. They possess gold in abundance and receive the products brought to them from the other remotest portions of the earth. They attire themselves in robes and other kinds of raiment. They are altogether black. One remark made by Bakri about the Berbers of Tad and Mecca indicates that coins without markings must have been rather rare in Africa. After having described the kind of prostitution customary among them, the women grabbing hold of strangers, he gets around to mention of the sort of money they used. The dinars they used were of pure gold and were called sola, bald, because they bore no imprints. Thus, these documents allow us to be sure of the use in black Africa of imprinted gold coins, without, however, being able to know whether such imprints were effigies of local emperors or kings, or to know whether there was any generalized imperial currency minted apart from the Mitkal standard. The situation must have been comparable to that of the Greco-Latin city kingdoms after the invention of money by the Lydians in the 6th century BC, among other peculiarities. Each of these cities had its own system of measures, and, as a result, its own urban coinage stamped with the city's coat of arms. There existed no accepted relation of the exchange value of these currencies. According to the Tariq el-Fatah, Askia Daoud was the first to build financial depositories and even libraries. So, there existed in West Africa a whole gamut of currencies usable according to the value of the goods purchased. There was even a curious sort of currency in the form of squares of fabric, four spans to each side, manufactured in the textile center of Terenka on the upper Senegal. According to Bakri, these squares, called Chagouia, were in use at Silla, also on the Senegal, along with other currencies such as salt, copper rings, and Dora, a cereal. The Tariq es Sudan mentions, in describing the poverty resulting from the Moroccan occupation of Timbuktu, the existence of a stock exchange in that city. The exchange rate fell to 500 cowries. A remark by Ibn Hakal attests to the use of acknowledgement of debts in writing, and at the same time gives an idea of the enormous wealth of the country. He saw a text in which an inhabitant of Sijil Masa acknowledged his indebtedness to a citizen of Outagast in the sum of 40,000 dinars. To the author of the Book of Roads and Kingdoms, such an occurrence was unique in the trading world of the 10th century. Even in Baghdad, the capital of the Orient, one could find nothing like it. So Africa was distinguished in the world for its legendary wealth, which led the Arabs to say, quote, "Against the camel's mange use tar, and against poverty make a trip to the Sudan." Unquote. Import-export. The exported materials were gold, iron, tin, etc. Domestically, commerce in cola nuts, cereals such as Dora, and millet, from which a kind of beer was fermented, was active. The same was true for weaponry, spears, javelins, arrows, bows, etc. As for manufacture, one might mention the glass industry, which had made extraordinary strides in Benin. Commerce between East Africa and India and China was no less active in the 10th and 11th centuries. In that region, contrary to common opinion, the tribal stage was outgrown. The land was united into one great monarchy under the Mano Motapa. Metals, gold, tin, copper, were exploited largely for his own personal gain, according to well-established procedures. Organization of the work was very advanced. Experts have estimated the quantity of tin mined at Rockport as approximately 30,000 tons. The experts went to the east and the Chinese Far East through the port of Sofala. There was a whole merchant class. Its conflicts with the Arab immigrants are described in a book by Boureg bin Sharia entitled "Of the National Pride of Negroes and Their Disputes with White Men." All of these facts concerning East Africa are taken from a study by M. A. Jaspan. In West Africa, the products imported were wheat, raisins, figs, Saharan salt, cowries, copper, dates, henna, olives, tan hides, silk, cloth, brocade, Venetian pearls, and mirrors, and so on. Tobacco was probably introduced into Muslim West Africa at this time. Other products such as gum, Gummiferous mimosa, cucurbitaceae, and euphorbiae added to the trade. Bakri tells of a strange plant that existed at the time. It yielded a kind of fireproof wool that was woven into clothing. It was called terzi, but among the Berbers there was a stone possessing the same properties when softened. So we may well conclude that this strange product was asbestos rather than a plant. The Berbers from the region of Tatamaka and the blacks of Bornu locally mined a kind of agate that was sold as far away as Ghana. In the Sudan, it is made up to the present day into necklaces and pendants of impressive size. Along the Senegal River, according to Bakri, whips of worldwide reputation were made of hippopotamus hides. Means of transportation: roads. The usual method of transportation in the interior of black Africa was on a donkey, ox, camel, or mongrel horse, where there were no navigable waterways. Connection to the Mediterranean and Egypt across the Sahara was made by camel caravans. It is important to stress that this commercial initiative was taken by Arabs and not by Africans who traded only at the domestic markets of Djen, Timbuktu, Walletta, Adogast, Gao, and so on. It seems that the wealth of the continent always made it unnecessary for its inhabitants to risk the dangers of the high seas or the great international routes for commercial purposes. Likewise, in ancient times, Ethiopians and Egyptians virtually never left their homelands. Egypt possessed all the technical means and material resources to assure her mastery of the seas, but throughout the course of her history she left it to her cousin Phoenicia. Except for a few solitary navigators mentioned in tales and legends, not until the 18th dynasty did she build a fleet on the Red Sea. Egypt was born and remained an essentially continental power. Neither she nor Nubia ever became trading nations. One might suppose that, during the pre-colonial period, West Africa was not technologically capable of taking to sea, and attempt to explain in this way the absence of African maritime commerce created by local initiative. Some documents which we will quote below prove that this point of view is not acceptable. Even if it were, there was nothing in any case to prevent the peoples of the African empires from establishing camel caravans, as the Arabs did, and transporting their wares to the shores of the Mediterranean. All the technological conditions required for the Africans to develop caravans and become international traders by crossing the Sahara were at hand, but they never did so, because economic abundance and their own social structure obviated this necessity. So the dromedary has remained to this day in the use of Arab traders alone. It is the ideal animal for crossing the desert. This is why not only can it endure thirst, but it is able to store in its body hundreds of liters of water, which if need be can be restored to a more or less drinkable condition by slaughtering the beast. In this way, camel drivers have with them a ready supply of meat and water. According to Ibn Battuta, the Roads in the interior of Africa were absolutely safe. Having decided to visit the latter city, Malai, I hired but one Mesophyte to serve as my guide, since there is no need to travel by caravan, for the roads are that secure. From the documents left by Bakri, we can describe the network of routes that connected Black Africa with the Mediterranean and the Orient, its complexities, and the traveling conditions of the caravans. Along most of the routes, there were few wells of drinking water. It took several days' travel to reach one. One can see on the map that two principal routes connected the South Sahara with Black Africa. One of them went from Wadi Dra to Adagast. The other started out from Sijil Massa and went to Tamadelt and Uanu, which was a crossroads for all the routes leading to Black Africa. It took 51 days from Sijil Massa to Adagast. The wells along them were, for the former, Tezemet, Bir el Dejemalin, and Nalili, and for the latter, Camel Driver's Well or Bir el Dejemalin. The trip took 2 weeks from Adagast to the imperial capital of Ghana. From Ghana to Silla, along the upper Senegal, the caravans took 21 days. From Ghana to Gayo, 2 weeks. From Ghana to Agam, probably 5 days. From there to Ras Elma, 4 days. From this center to Taraka on the Niger, 6 days. From Gayo to Tetemeka, 9 days were required. From there to Gadames across the desert, 40 days. From this crossroads to Tripoli, 11 days. And finally, from Gadames, one went to Kairouan. Economic wealth. From the economic point of view, Africa is characterized by abundance. Travelers of the pre-colonial era encountered no poverty there, according to the Tariq el-Fatak, the emperor of Ghana, seated upon a platform of red gold, daily treated the people of his capital to 10,000 meals. Such material comfort resulted in an increase in demographic density scarcely imaginable today. In the region of Djinn alone, there were 7,777 villages. The following fact is enough to give us an idea of the proximity of these villages one to another. If the Sultan, for example, wishes to summon a person inhabiting a village situated in the neighborhood of Lake Debo, his chosen messenger betakes himself to one of the gateways of the ramparts and, from there, cries out the message he has been charged to convey. The people from village to village repeat this call, and the message immediately reaches the intended party, who goes to the convocation sent to him. No need for further demonstration to show how densely this territory is populated. Under the Askia el-Hajj, a census taken by a group of students which lasted 3 days established that Gayo consisted of 7,626 blocks of houses of solid construction, not counting straw huts. It has been estimated that the slave trade swallowed up 100 to 300 million individuals, dead or shipped to America. So had it not been for slavery, the total figure of black population on the continent would probably have been 4 times what it now is. It would have been in the vicinity of 400 million. The Tariq es Sudan stresses how exceptional poverty was in black Africa when describing that caused by the Moroccan occupation of Timbuktu. The high cost of food in Timbuktu was excessive. A great number of people died of hunger, and the famine was such that people ate the corpses of dead animals and of human beings. The exchange rate fell to 500 calories. Then the plague came in turn to decimate the population and killed many that the famine had spared. This high cost of food, which lasted 2 years, ruined the inhabitants, who were reduced to selling their furniture and utensils. All the elders were unanimous in saying that they had never seen such a calamity, and that not one of the elders before them had ever told them of anything like it. Comparison of socio-economic structures in Africa and Europe. The time has now come to examine the passage from feudal production to capitalist production in Europe, to see whether such a development, such a transformation occurred in the African economy of the corresponding period, and if not, why not? Karl Marx showed in Das Kapital that the feudal organization in the countryside and the corporations in the cities for a long time kept the money capital, resulting from usury and commerce in the Middle Ages, from being transferred into industrial capital. The upheaval which was to give birth to modern capitalism, according to the same author, began at the end of the 15th century and developed with increasing intensity during the 16th, especially in England. Royalty and Parliament went to war against the feudal lords to try to win back central authority. In increasingly difficult circumstances, the lords successively got rid of everything superfluous in their lives. That meant liquidation of the lordly entourages and the abandonment of pomp in the court life. Then came the first exodus of country folk to the cities. Overnight, there was thus created a proletariat without either hearth or home, whose numbers would go on increasing even more for other reasons. Against the violent repression of king and parliament, the lords reacted by progressively confiscating the lands of all the peasants who were tilling the soil under feudal tenure. Serfdom was no more. Those formerly bound to the soil were now independent peasants, at most paying some fixed tribute to the lord. Then these peasants in turn were driven into the cities. The movement of expropriation spread to the ecclesiastical communal domains by a system of enclosure, which consisted purely and simply of annexing the lands adjoining the lord's domain by putting a fence around them. The lords had in fact found that, due to the prodigious development of the manufacture of woolens in Flanders, it was henceforth more profitable to turn all the arable lands into pastures for raising wool-bearing sheep. Later, some domains of the Scottish Highlands would be turned into hunting forests for profit. Of cities and towns pulled down for sheep walks, and no more but the lordships now standing in them, I could say somewhat. Conditions suitable for the birth of capitalism have been created. For this system to appear, as Marx says, there must be a separation between work and working conditions, making a true class of wage earners, in the modern sense of the term. Before expropriation, the peasant family tilling the soil at the same time carried on a whole range of artisanal activities, constituting cottage industry. They wove their clothes from the flax they harvested and manufactured most of the things they needed. In becoming a wage earner, the peasant no longer had anything but the strength of his labor to sell to urban manufacturers or country farmers. He could no longer produce at home the things he needed for domestic use, but had to buy them as manufactured products on the home market, which the capitalist circuit had established between countryside and city. A man who, to begin with, inherited or could borrow enough money might go to the country and sublet from the lord a part of his land. He became a farmer to whom the land was leased. His capital was all he had to work with. In a second phase, he might hire hands to work his land. He became the rural capitalist, supplying raw materials to feed the industries of the cities. From him, the manufacturer would get the flax for his weaving. The one and the other found it to their interest to pay the lowest possible wages for the greatest amount of work, no matter that working conditions might be inhumane, that workers might become alienated. This form of economic activity will constantly be dominated by the goal of profit and super profit. It would not take long for the importance of manpower to be minimized by the introduction of the machine. The capitalist system thus appears better suited to the development of applied science than had been the one based on domestic economy which it had just destroyed. The use of machinery was limited and unnecessary in the latter, because there was no concern with profit and productivity in the capitalistic sense of the term. So it would seem to be more judicious to explain the development of mechanization by the needs of capitalist production, rather than to justify the system as being a consequence of the use of machinery. The needs of the new home market, thus created with its peculiar structure, and those of the world market resulting from the great voyages of discovery, will constantly stimulate the economic activity of the European countries. The modern type of trading country had thus been created, the very type whose wealth excludes that of the people. Of course, the newly created proletariat was not entirely and automatically absorbed by industry, but it was subject to the law of supply and demand. The unemployment which resulted turned a great many individuals into vagabonds, thieves, or vagrants, as they were called. This ever increasing flood of unemployed hands finally frightened the masters of industry, although they had at first seen it as a happy divine intervention intended to make the economy prosper. The parliaments of the different European countries soon began to consider it the germ of future revolutionary troubles. There was as yet no experience of modern revolutions. It had not yet been sufficiently realized that in order to be revolutionary, it was not enough to be numerous and malcontented, but that organization and education were required. So a panic as widespread as it was unadmitted took hold of the parliamentary legislators and led them to pass laws so terrible, so coercive, that it is hard for us to imagine them today. In 1530, in England, under the reign of Henry VIII, a vagrant picked up for the second time was whipped and had half an ear cut off. Taken for a third time, he was to be executed as a hardened criminal and enemy of the Commonwealth. 72,000 vagrants were thus executed during that reign. In the time of Edward VI, quote, if anyone refuses to work, he shall be condemned as a slave to the person who denounced him as an idler, unquote. The owner of such a slave might whip him, chain him, and brand him on cheek and forehead with the letter S for slave. If he disappeared for 2 weeks, if he ran away a third time, he was executed. The master can sell him, bequeath him, let him out on hire as a slave just as any other personal chattel or cattle. If the slaves attempt anything against the masters, they are also to be executed. Justices of the peace, on information, are to hunt the rascals down. An idler caught on the highway was branded on the chest with a V for vagrant, and returned to his native city, whose slave he became, doing municipal work without pay, held in irons. If he gave the name of a false city, he was none the less made a slave, marked with an S. Inhabitants of the said city were allowed to take possession of his offspring, present and future, and keep them as apprentices until the age of 24 for boys and 20 for girls. If the latter tried prematurely to take their freedom, they automatically became the slaves of their employers, who whipped and chained them. They had the right to weld on the neck, arm, or leg of the slave as an iron ring as a distinctive mark to keep him from escaping. Slaves of towns or parishes subsisted into the 19th century under the name of roundsmen, as Marx points out. The same laws remained in force under the reign of Elizabeth, 1572. An 18-year-old vagrant arrested for the second time was to be executed unless someone will take them into service for 2 years. Under the reign of Queen Bess, rogues were trussed up apace, and in 1 year commonly 300 or 400 were devoured and eaten up by the gallows. The situation was exactly the same under James I. Idlers were branded with the letter R for rogue on their left shoulders. Only in 1715 was this legislation abolished in England. Similar laws existed in France until the beginning of the reign of Louis XVI. Every man in good health, from 16 to 60 years of age, if without means of subsistence, but not practicing a trade, is to be sent to the galleys. Of the same nature are the statute of Charles V for the Netherlands, October 1537. The first edict of the states and towns of Holland, March 10, 1614. The Placat of the United Provinces, June 26, 1649, etc. Because of all these European-originated deportations, it can be asserted without exaggeration that present-day America is populated in part by citizens of slave or indentured origin, whether they be white or black. To conclude, we must recall the terrible conditions under which child labor was exploited, the one-sided legislation on wages that was constantly intended to favor the employer. Thus, the capitalistic ownership of the social means of production by the few was the negation and superseding of the dwarf property of the earlier domestic economy. According to Marx, in the latter, because of the excessive spreading of the means of production among an infinite number of individuals, there was no possibility of cooperation in production on any large scale, nor of the division of labor within each separate process of production, the control over and the productive application of the forces of nature by society, and the free development of the social productive forces. It is compatible only with a system of production and a society moving within narrow or more or less primitive bounds. To perpetuate it would be, as Pecora rightly says, to decree universal mediocrity. The accidents of European history which led to the systematic expropriation of the peasants are not general laws, but without this phenomenon of expropriation, capitalism would not have come to be. One would therefore like to know the immutable sociological laws which explain the necessary passage from the stage of domestic economy to capitalism in all societies, to know why India, China, remained for millennia in relative stagnation despite the terrible poverty which existed in those countries. Why the industrious population of Japan, with its great density, which necessitated micro cultivation, did not undergo an identical evolution. Why the political social balance of Africa was broken only at contact with an external influence. To what degree does the ideological superstructure constitute, for some social structures, an iron collar equivalent to an immense weight holding down the society for some unpredictable period, thus outweighing for a long time such material factors as poverty? Modern capitalism, wherever it may be found, is a European export, and not the result of natural local evolution. We may therefore regret that there is no precise answer to these questions to be found in Das Kapital. The latter indicates only that when this industrial regime of small independent producers reaches a certain stage of development, it brings forth the material agencies for its own dissolution. From that moment, new forces and new passions spring up in the bosom of society. It must be annihilated. It is annihilated. Its annihilation, the transformation of the individualized and scattered means of production into the socially concentrated ones, of the pygmy property of the many into the huge property of the few, this fearful and painful expropriation of the mass of the people forms the prelude to the history of capital. No writer until this date has ever attempted to evaluate correctly the stage after which the material agencies of dissolution are engendered, so that the necessary historical transformation can take place. Domestic industry is the thesis, capitalism is the antithesis. But the dialectical link, the path inexorably leading from the one to the other, has not been recognized and described in satisfactory fashion for all societies. At any time, it goes without saying, some societies today can be spared the capitalist phase. Pre-colonial Africa was then at the stage of pygmy property. The peasant family wove its own clothing. Bakri tells us that each house had its own spinner. Obviously, the division of labor reflected by the caste system did not allow the manufacture of everything that was needed. All one could do was work in the craft allowed for his caste. For everything else, they had to turn to the open market, sometimes by barter, but in general by actual purchase for money. This system, which precluded competition with others in their professions, constituted a true monopoly. Each caste monopolized an economic activity sanctified by tradition. The same frame of mind was to be found in the European corporations or guilds of the Middle Ages. However, it seems that they had not gone so far as to form professional associations for the defense of group interests. The living tradition was amply sufficient to guarantee that. Therefore, no separation between domestic industry and agriculture, a separation prerequisite for the appearance of capitalism. We have seen that the term property implied different realities from Europe to Africa, where appropriation of the land was concerned. In Africa, it would be more precise to speak of the use of the land, even in the so-called royal domains. The accent was placed rather upon the human domain of the king working these lands. Enumeration of the different families of captives was what expressed the wealth of a personage. The The African king, however powerful, was easily persuaded that the soil did not belong to him. This is especially applicable to emigrant kings. They easily accepted the sacred authority of the original occupants, even if the latter were presently without any material power. This explains the deference of the powerful king of the Messina to one of the local princes of the Mima region, the Tukiferi Soma. Before him, the king of the Messina had to remain standing, cover himself with dust while swearing fidelity to him, and remove his bubu to drape himself in it. The title of this prince has survived to this day, but the one who now bears it has fallen from power and can only walk, having no steed. His authority has vanished, but his title remains. The king of the Messina still goes to visit this personage, asserting that this brings him good luck. He consults him and asks him to pray for him. He dismounts to salute him and visits him at the place where his ruined capital used to be. This singular personage, so described, is the former sovereign, still the master of the soil, in the ritual sense of that term. He is the one who allots lands to newcomers without first consulting the king. He has received the land in trust. He never sells it. He would not dare to. So, for religious reasons, he allots only the use of it. The sale of land, properly speaking, seems to have been unknown in traditional pre-colonial Africa. To grasp the historical peculiarities of the country, one would have to imagine a victorious Julius Caesar showing similar deference to Vercingetorix, the vanquished autochthonous prince, the original occupant of the land. We might go even further and observe that, in truth, the problem of land ownership appears never to have existed in Africa. Instead of land having constituted a wealth beyond the reach of certain social categories, it was within everyone's grasp, with no need to forfeit one's freedom, like the serf bound to the soil in order to make use of it, to possess it. The slave had his own patch of ground. The stranger who just this morning came to the village would also get his. Expropriation of the sort seen in the 16th century Europe was unthinkable in the history of pre-colonial Africa. Perhaps it was the vast expanse of arable lands that shielded Africa from this social problem. So Africa never had the rural capitalist who was the farmer owner acting as intermediary between the true owner of the soil and the expropriated agricultural wage earner. Navetanism. The category of peasants called Navetanese in Wolof do not constitute a class. Its members do not know one another, are not bound by any traditional group solidarity. They are mobile because, in the main, they are young bachelors who go away to look for work, so as to accumulate a dowry with which they can return to marry in their villages and settle down permanently. Navetanism is thus a transitional stage in the life of a young man. He goes away with the permanent intention of one day returning home. He is no man's slave. No contract could permanently bind him to the land of any lord. The root of the word in Wolof means literally to spend the winter, i.e., the rainy season. Contracts automatically end with that season and are renewable only by agreement. Drought and progressive exhaustion of the soil are the principal reasons impelling young men of a particular village to spend the rainy season in a region with more water, not yet exhausted by cultivation. In a word, better endowed by nature. Since the desert is creeping into black Africa from north to south above the equator, these peregrinations follow the same direction. It was drought which brought about the dispersion of the inhabitants of the former capital of Ghana and the entire region of the Ogaду. It also caused the successive retreats on the left bank of the Senegal River. Many of the people of the Jambur and Cayor regions, today half deserts, withdrew toward the Baoul, while the inhabitants of that area, especially the peasants, went off in the direction of the Sine Salem, the British Gambia, and Casamance, all regions located further south and decidedly more humid. Only the powerful attraction of Dakar's economic pole was able to swing this tide westward, insofar as Senegal is concerned. The peasants who thus escaped the hard and monotonous seasonal rhythm of local economic life ended up by settling in the suburbs of that city, although that was not their original intention. They had come with the idea of returning home as usual. Once settled there, under the changed living conditions, they gradually lost their peasant attitudes as they found work at the docks or in various urban industries, and this finally made them aware of the fact that they were workers, thus a phenomenon of growing proletarianization. The Talibe. The set of mind of the Talibe, the believer, in the Morid, Tijane, and other communities carried no seed of social upheaval, for the believer was not bound to the marabout against his will. He had voluntarily submitted himself so as to enter paradise in which he believed he could at any time break the spiritual bond tying him to the marabout. This relatively rare act of disaffiliation was called in Wolof Vudet. The body of such believers were grouped in the community Dara, in which all the means of production were concentrated. The believer shunned possessions. He felt that his own power to work, apparently the only thing left to him, did not belong to him. It was in the service of the marabout, with whom he had made a metaphysical contract, assuring him a place in paradise after death. Thus, even the pre-colonial marabout system could not lead to social revolutions, because a believer was unaware that he was expropriated and exploited. Slave manpower. Concentration. The end of the Middle Ages and the whole of the Renaissance in Europe were characterized by a degree of slavery as intense as and more detestable than what Africa had known. This will become clearer by what is to follow. It is customary to consider slavery as a specifically African phenomenon, but we have just seen that until the end of the aforementioned period, white men were in the habit of reducing their own fellows to slavery. The serf of the Middle Ages was as totally in thrall as the African slave. Fustel de Coulanges referred to him as the rustic slave. So this institution was characteristic of all mankind, regardless of color. It is erroneous to believe that European slavery, especially in modern times, was but an exceptional and fragmentary social phenomenon. After its contact with Africa, 16th century Europe progressively lost the custom of internal slavery and, taking advantage of its superiority in arms, substituted black slavery. After the contact with Europe, the lot of Africa's slaves suddenly got worse, since it then became possible for them to be sold to persons who would export them, with the whole chain of well known evils entailed in these forced crossings. Slavery is certainly the great chink in African social organization, but the documents available prove that the African slaves who were not deported in general enjoyed living conditions incomparably superior to those of white slaves in Europe. Slaves of the kings of Malai and the Askias of Gael enjoyed complete liberty of movement. Thus, an ordinary slave of the Askia Daoud, a native of Kanta, was able to carry out a pilgrimage to Mecca without his master's knowledge. On his return, instead of listening to the hypocritical words of his Uandu herald, who tried to incite him against the slave, the king pardoned him along with 100 members of his tribe, the Diam Uali, Diam Tene, and Sorobana tribes, while being slaves of the Askia, occupied a whole territory whose soil they cultivated for their own account, giving only a predetermined share of their crops to their sovereign. When the latter made a present of them to an erudite Muslim named Muhammad Tulay, they remained on their lands unhindered. Their life in no way changed, and their new master, according to tradition, merely went on getting the same share of the crops taken from them. When Askia Muhammad defeated Sunni Baru Dal, the son of Sunni Ali, he took over some 24 slave tribes that belonged to him. The Tariq el-Fatah gives details about the social life of these tribes, and in particular the system of shares which was applicable to them. Before belonging to Songhai, they too had first been the property of the king of Mali. Starting only with the Sunni Madogo did they change imperial masters. The first three tribes were of Bambara origin, and had most likely not yet been converted to Islam, if Kati is to be believed. In other words, the slave might be of a religion other than that of his master. The king of Malai selected his domestic servants from among them. When one of them wished to marry, the king would furnish a dowry of 40,000 cowries to the parents-in-law of the groom, so as to prevent the wife or children from claiming their freedom, and in order to make sure that they and their progeny would always remain the property of the Malay Khoi. In the days of the Malay Khois, and ever since these tribes first belonged to them, they had been obligated to pay an annual tribute of 40 cubits of cultivated land per couple, man and wife. Thus it was until the time these tribes were handed over to the chiefs. With these crops the king fed his army. If they were insufficient or of poor quality, a new compensatory tax was levied upon the tribes for having been responsible for bad agricultural management. Under Askia Muhammad, however, the shares taken became more reasonable, more humane. They were collected in the following manner. A graduated tax in kind was levied on each couple at harvest time. After having appraised the holdings of each family, the king's tax collector would take 10 measures of flour from any who could supply only that much, 20 from those who could supply no more, and 30 from all others. Even if they were capable of providing 1,000, this limit indeed was never to be exceeded, however much individual wealth a slave might have. A dark shadow clouds this almost too beautiful picture. The Asker bartered some of the tribe's children for horses. The fourth tribe, the Tendigetas, were dispersed from Gao as far as Sibiri Dugu. No one tried to stop the peregrinations of these people. When the Asker met one of them along his way, at a strong point or in a village, he could tell only by the individual's ethnic name that he was one of his slaves. He might then do with him whatever he wished. From the period of Mali until that of Gao, the only kind of tax imposed on this tribe was to supply the feed necessary for the king's horses. The hostlers were furnished by it as well, and the adults built the boats needed to transport the hay, at least during the reign of the Askias. The tax thus assumed an increasingly functional character. One's occupation or economic status was the basis for the tax imposed on him. The Zenji, the fifth tribe, extending from Kanta to Sibiri Dugu, who lived by fishing, paid their tax in dried fish when the water was low. It ranged from 1 to 10 parcels of dried fish according to the means. The 10-packet maximum was never to be exceeded. This tribe also supplied the boats and crews needed for certain types of transportation. The sixth tribe, the Arbis, were exempt from the levy since under the Askias it was from them that all the domestic servants and confidential special emissaries came from. The women served the king's wives, while the youth escorted the king on his peaceable or warring outings. The seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, and 11th tribes were blacksmiths of foreign extraction. Their male ancestor had been the blacksmith slave of a Christian master living somewhere on an island in the Atlantic, one of the Canaries or Cape Verde Islands. We do not know. At any rate, the slave was said to have escaped and taken refuge in Kukia under the reign of Sunni Muhammad Farai. We have noted that in general men of the caste could not be taken as slaves. If that rule were broken, it was perhaps because the individual in question was of foreign extraction. He had come into the country already a slave. However that may be, his descendants, instead of being concentrated in one place, were dispersed so as to avoid any coalition among them. Kati observes that these aliens followed filiation through the paternal line, contrary to African customs. The taxes imposed from time immemorial on these 5 tribes amounted to 100 spears and 100 arrows per family each year. The 12th tribe occupied the territory between Gao and Fanai. According to Kati, the Askia Daoud had plantations throughout the land, from the Ere, the Dendai, the Kulane, etc. He estimates the total annual crop at 4,000 sacks of grain, which by present day calculations does not seem a great deal. The work on these plantations was carefully organized and done by slaves. Each plantation was managed by a Fanfa, who might have under him 160, 50, 40, or 20 slaves. The name means both slave master and ship's master. The plantation of Abda in the Dendai territory employed 200 slaves with 4 Fanfas, all under another head named Misa Kul Allah. It yielded 1,000 sunus of rice. Sunus were leather sacks holding about 250 liters. Seed in sacks were supplied by the Askia. 10 boats were used to transport the cereals. At harvest time, the agent sent to collect it brought from the Askia to the head Fanfa, according to custom, 1 whole block of salt, 1,000 kola nuts, and a black boo and a black loincloth for his wife. The personal wealth of this head Fanfa, who was none the less a slave, could easily exceed in cereals alone 1,000 sunus. His situation was thus in no way comparable to that of a member of the plebes of antiquity or a serf of the Middle Ages bound to the soil. Such agricultural wealth was stored in clay granaries used for purposes of silage. It sometimes happened that such a plantation, with all those working on it, was given as a present to a sharif, a scholar, or any other friend of the king. This is how the plantation of Jangaja was given to the Alpha Kati, a native scholar. The crops then went to a new master, but the social situation of the workers remained unchanged. One institution of Askia Daoud seems to indicate that the soldiers must have been mostly of slave origin. It was he who inaugurated the system under which the king was heir to all his soldiers' goods, because he said they were his slaves. Before that it had not been so, and the king inherited only the soldier's horse, shield, and javelins, nothing else. As for the custom the kings had of taking the daughters of their soldiers and using them for their own pleasure, it was a deplorable custom which existed before his reign. A freed slave was entitled to a deed of manumission drawn up in proper legal form. This was the case of an old woman who was part of the legacy of the Jengo Musa Sagansaro, who, according to Kati, was freed by Askia Daoud. The facts mentioned in this chapter constitute additional information on the organization of civil administration and labor. One can see in general how taxes must have been levied. The social condition of the slaves had been clearly drawn. The treatment was not inhumane for the period, as long as they remained within the area. They were more and more sort of subjects of the king. The misfortune lay in the awful and hateful fact that they might at any moment be sold. From that viewpoint, their situation was identical with that of the white European slave of the same period. Beyond that, they were better off, as we have just shown. Retribalization. We can see at work here the characteristically African phenomenon of apparent retribalization. Kati tells us the ethnic family names of the first slaves who were the originators of the 24 tribes belonging to the emperors of Malai and Gao. They were ordinary individuals whom the sovereign allowed to found a house which would proliferate in geometric progression through the generations. These large families, which numbered thousands of members after a short while, had all the external appearances of a clan or tribe, as to number, identity of name, and collateral relationships. Yet they totally lacked the social structure and organization of the clan. Their members were merely a juxtaposition of individuals integrated into an already highly developed monarchic society who are at most only conscious of the degree of kinship through the ethnic names appearing in the census. Primitive accumulation. We now have a general idea of the productive forces, the means of production, accumulation, and disposal, and whom they belong to. There was not, on the one hand, a social minority possessing these means and accumulating them in a few shops, and, on the other hand, a mass of expropriated persons forced to sell their labor power to this minority in order to live, according to the latter analysis of Marx and Engels. Africa was thus at the stage of natural economy, characterized by the production of only what is barely necessary for existence. Such an economy is an obstacle to the appearance of capitalism. However, on examining things more closely, we see that it was not exactly that way. In the marketplaces of Timbuktu, Djinn, and elsewhere, there were people producing with the sole purpose of resale, and, as Rosa Luxemburg points out, this is the main condition for the appearance of capitalism. Nevertheless, if one considers the duration of this period of natural economy in Africa, one must realize that the process of primitive accumulation, that is, the separation of labor and the conditions of labor, took place there at the slow pace of a secondary chemical reaction, thoroughly negligible when compared to the principal reaction. It seems that it was the African collectivism described in the preceding chapter, the moral and material security it assured every individual, which made useless, if not superfluous, the accumulation of excessive wealth. Even the riches of the king do not seem huge by modern standards. Hoarding, usury, and all forms of excessive concentration of individual wealth are only the reflection of social anxiety, uncertainty about tomorrow. A sort of shield for oneself and one's kin against a cruel fate. It is in an individualistic society that we see the great growth of such a phenomenon. This was true of the West throughout its history. Indo-Aryan individualism, dating from earliest antiquity, and the feeling of social insecurity inherent in it, developed the spirit of struggle for life more than anywhere else. When the history of societies is written, it will be seen that from the Aegean period to our own day, that of the Europeans was the hardest, roughest, least clement for the individual who was forced, condemned to a constant struggle lest he disappear. Of course, the struggle for life is a law of nature, but it applies there more than anywhere else. Without any margin of safety, one whose means give out sinks before the indifferent eyes of others. This social coldness extends far beyond the period of modern capitalism to cover the history of Europe from the time of Athens until today. No political, social education has so far radically changed the Occidental mind in this respect. The technical and intellectual progress due to constant and necessary busyness, the energy with which one must imperturbably amass ever more wealth, the peculiar forms that these activities assume and their repercussion upon the social order, the development of mercantilism, all these seem to flow in large part from one same initial principle. Even a certain love of risk results from this necessity. In order to escape from slavery in Europe, as we have seen, one had to have a remunerative means of support. The same social reason accounted for the search for an inheritance or credit, so as to set up as a farmer employer in the country, or commission a ship and try one's luck on the high seas. The rise and development of maritime commerce remained for a very long time a private business before being taken over by the various European countries. From Homer's day to our own, through Athens, Rome, and the Middle Ages, it would be difficult to find a period with a properly natural economy. The mercantilism inherent from the Cretans and Phoenicians has gone on and grown stronger except for a few moments of decline. Two factors appear to have stimulated commerce: the small size and especially the comparative poverty of the mother country on one hand, and on the other, a certain numerical weakness of the population which eliminated all hope of achieving fortune by force of arms, by the conquest of other countries. Commercial activity often seems the form of economic adaptation of minorities. Such was the case with the Phoenicians, besides the powerful Egyptian nation. Such was also the case for Genoa and Venice until the destruction of Constantinople by Muhammad II, and the Libano-Syrians and Israelites in our times. Such would seem to have been the case for certain black African groups, such as the Jula, among others. The commercial activity of Athens must have been stimulated by the geographic context and the poverty of Greece. Numerous and powerful peoples living in under renowned regions, such as the Germanic, throughout history have been conquerors. In modern times, with such universal and pacifistic minds as Goethe, the Germanic drive from north to south took on a literary turn. Kennst du das Land, wo die Zitronen blühen? Do you know the land where the lemon trees bloom? To the extent that African collectivism and European individualism grow out of the material conditions of existence, the preceding consideration are founded upon a objective basis. End of chapter 6.